There is a particular kind of quiet that follows you when you have spent too much time alone. Not the peaceful quiet of a chosen retreat, but the kind that accumulates slowly, almost without your noticing, until one day you look around and realize that the distance between you and the people you once felt close to has grown into something that feels permanent. You have tried to explain it. You have sat across from people who love you and searched for the right words to describe what is happening inside you, and come up empty. It is not loneliness exactly, though loneliness is part of it. It is something stranger than that. It is the feeling of being shaped by an experience that leaves no visible marks, of carrying something inside you that has no name, of becoming someone you do not entirely recognize, in a way that does not feel like loss, but does not feel like gain either. Not yet. You wonder sometimes if something is wrong with you. You wonder why you cannot simply enjoy the things that used to bring you pleasure. Why the company of others sometimes feels like an effort that costs more than it returns. Why solitude has become not a preference, but a necessity you did not ask for. And you have probably heard people tell you to get out more, to reconnect, to stop spending so much time inside your own head. You have tried that too, and it helped, sometimes in the moment. But the moment passed and the quiet returned, and with it the sense that something is working itself out in you, something that cannot be rushed and cannot be explained and cannot be shared, not yet. What I want to explore with you today is the possibility that what you are experiencing is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be understood. And the understanding, when it comes, changes everything about how you relate to your own solitude, your own strangeness, your own becoming. Because there is a kind of strength that only grows in the condition of walking alone. And it is unlike any other kind of strength you will encounter in your life. It does not announce itself. It does not come with recognition or applause. It develops in the absence of those things, and that is precisely why it develops into something no one around you can quite explain, and perhaps why you yourself cannot explain it. Not yet. If this is opening something for you, consider subscribing. I explore these territories every week, and I would be glad to have you along for the journey. To understand what happens to a person who spends a genuine time in solitude, we have to first examine what we mean when we say alone. The common understanding of aloneness is essentially negative. To be alone is to be without company, without connection, without the validation and reflection that other people provide. In this frame, solitude is deprivation. It is something that happens to people who have been left, or who have failed to maintain the ties that hold human lives together. The alone person is a diminished person, a person whose social world has contracted, whose resources have narrowed. This is the story most of us have inherited about what it means to walk without company, and it is why the alone person so often feels the need to explain or justify themselves, to insist that they are fine, to make clear that this is a choice rather than a fate, to perform a contentment they may not entirely feel. But this frame, this understanding of aloneness as absence, misses something fundamental about what actually happens to the human mind when it is removed from constant social stimulation and left to encounter itself. And I do not mean this in a romantic or mystical sense. I mean it in the most precise, observable sense possible. When you are consistently alone, when solitude becomes a sustained condition rather than a temporary respite, something happens to the relationship between you and your own thinking. It changes. It deepens. It becomes something qualitatively different from what most people experience as their inner life. And this change is not comfortable. In fact, it is often the opposite of comfortable, which is part of why it tends to look from the outside like suffering, and why even the person going through it often does not recognize it as growth until much later. I know many of you watching this have never spoken to anyone about the specific texture of what you experience when you are alone with yourself for extended periods. You have kept it to yourself, partly because you are not sure how to describe it, and partly because you suspect others would not understand. How long have you been carrying this particular aloneness, this particular quality of being separate from the people around you? I want you to share in the comments below. Not because I need engagement, but because someone else watching this right now needs to know they are not the only one experiencing this. They need to see your words, and if it is too much to articulate right now, if the weight of it makes language difficult, just type this: I walk alone too. Just those 4 words. Because the moment you write them, you break a silence that has been keeping you more isolated than the solitude itself ever could. Your willingness to be seen in your aloneness gives others permission to be seen in theirs, and that is a gift that reaches further than you will ever know. Here is what I want you to understand about what happens in sustained solitude. There is a philosopher whose work illuminates this with remarkable precision, and though she wrote primarily about the political world, her observations about the inner life cut to something essential about the human condition. Hannah Arendt made a distinction between loneliness and solitude that most people who have written about aloneness have failed to make as clearly. Loneliness, she argued, is the experience of being cut off from human company in a way that makes you feel your own existence is somehow unreal, unconfirmed, uncertain. Loneliness is the pain of being without the witnesses that make us feel our lives are happening, that we matter, that we are seen. It is a genuinely painful condition, and it is one that the alone person often cycles through, especially in the early stages of their withdrawal or separation from ordinary social life. But solitude, Arendt suggested, is something else entirely. Solitude is the condition in which you are alone with yourself in a way that is not absence but presence. Not the absence of others, but the presence of your own thinking, your own company, the company of the self with itself. And this distinction matters enormously, because it means that the path through loneliness, the way out of its particular suffering, is not always a return to company, but sometimes a deepening into solitude, a learning to be present with yourself in a way that most people never fully develop, because they never spend enough time without the noise and reflection of others to discover that they have something there, something steady and real and capable of sustaining itself. What makes this difficult to see from the outside and difficult to trust from the inside is that the development of this inner presence does not happen cleanly. It does not proceed in a straight line from pain to clarity. It moves through phases that can feel like regression, like dissolution, like the opposite of growth. There is a period, sometimes a long one, when the person walking alone encounters not a rich inner life but a kind of void, a silence that does not feel peaceful but threatening, an emptiness that raises the question of whether there is actually anything there at all. This is the stage that looks from the outside most like depression or dysfunction. The person is quiet, withdrawn, seems to have lost something. And they have, in a sense. They have lost the constant stream of external confirmation that most of us rely on to feel that we exist, that we are real, that we are okay. Think of it this way. Most people move through their lives in a constant state of reflection of others. They know who they are because others reflect it back to them. They know what they think because conversation sharpens and reveals it. They know what they feel because the reactions of people around them help name and validate those feelings. This is not a failure or a weakness. It is simply how human consciousness tends to develop in ordinary social conditions. We are social beings, and our sense of self is normally maintained through the network of relationships and interactions that surround us. When that network thins or disappears, something disorienting happens. The usual sources of confirmation go quiet. And in that quiet, the person is left with the task of finding or building some other ground to stand on. This is the crucible. This is where the strength that no one can explain begins to form. Not in the absence of struggle, but inside the struggle itself. Because the person who is forced, or who chooses, to sit in that void without fleeing it, without immediately filling it with distraction or noise or a new set of people to reflect off, that person is doing something extraordinarily demanding. They are learning to generate their own ground. They are discovering that the self does not require constant external confirmation to be real. That thinking does not require an audience to be valid. That feeling does not require a witness to be true. This discovery is slow and often painful and comes with no guarantee. But when it comes, it changes the structure of a person's relationship to their own existence in a way that nothing else does. Arendt wrote about what she called the two in one, the dialogue that takes place within a single person between themselves and themselves. Most people experience this dialogue in fragments, in fleeting moments of reflection before sleep, in passing interior observations that dissolve almost as soon as they form. But the person who spends real time in solitude, who learns to sit with themselves long enough for the internal conversation to develop depth and continuity, that person discovers something that is genuinely surprising. They discover that they are company, not in a grandiose or self-satisfied sense, but in the simple, practical sense that they can spend time with themselves without needing to escape. They can think without needing someone to think with. They can feel without needing someone to validate the feeling. And this capacity, once developed, does not disappear when they return to the company of others. It remains. It becomes the ground they carry with them. This is why the person who has walked alone for a significant period develops a quality that others sense but cannot quite name. It is not confidence exactly, though it can look like confidence. It is not independence exactly, though it contains independence. It is something closer to what you might call interiority, a depth of inner life that is being cultivated through actual practice, through the difficult work of being with oneself, when being with others would have been easier. And this interiority changes how a person moves through the world in ways that are subtle but pervasive. It changes how they listen, because they are no longer listening primarily to find confirmation of themselves in what others say. It changes how they speak, because they have spent enough time with their own thoughts to know what they actually think rather than what they are expected to think. It changes how they respond to pressure and uncertainty, because they have developed a relationship with their own inner stability that does not depend on favorable external conditions to persist. If what I'm exploring here is landing somewhere real in you, I want you to know you are not alone in this journey. Many people arrive at these questions after years of carrying their solitude in silence, years of wondering whether what was happening to them was damage or development. I create these videos for people who are ready to go deeper, who sense that there is something important in their experience that has not yet been named or understood. If that is you, consider subscribing, not because you need another voice in your life, but because the work of understanding yourself goes better with companions who are asking the same questions. There are many of us here, exploring these territories together, and I would be honored to have you among us. So if this feels right, hit that subscribe button and share in the comments what resonated most with you today. I read everyone, and your reflections often show me angles on these ideas that I had not considered. There is something else that happens to the person who walks alone that is worth examining carefully, because it is the source of much of the strength that others find difficult to explain. When you spend real time in solitude, you encounter yourself without the usual softening that social life provides. Other people, by their very presence, tend to moderate our experience of ourselves. They distract us from our more uncomfortable inner contents. They provide narratives about who we are that we can inhabit rather than constructing our own. They offer interpretations of events that we can adopt rather than sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. Remove all of that, and what you are left with is something quite raw. You are left with your own patterns, your own fears, your own recurring thoughts and impulses and resistances, unmediated by anyone else's presence or interpretation. This encounter can be genuinely difficult. It is one of the reasons that people who find themselves suddenly alone through loss or circumstance or choice often experience something that feels like a kind of crisis. What they are experiencing is not just the loss of the other person or people. They are experiencing themselves without the buffer those relationships provided. And the self that shows up in that unmediated encounter is not always easy to be with. It carries unexamined assumptions, inherited fears, unresolved patterns of thought and feeling that had been successfully avoided through the management of ordinary social life. But here is what I want you to understand about this encounter, about this difficult meeting with yourself that solitude makes unavoidable. Every person who walks alone long enough, and honestly enough, eventually stops being surprised by what they find in themselves. Not because the contents become more comfortable, but because familiarity changes the relationship. When you have sat with your own darkness often enough, it stops being the terrifying thing it was at first and becomes simply part of the terrain. It becomes something you have learned to navigate. And this familiarity with your own interior landscape is perhaps the deepest source of the strength that others observe and cannot explain. A person who knows their own depths is not easily destabilized by events or by the judgments of others, not because they have become invulnerable, but because they have already survived the encounter with their own most difficult contents. They have already faced the thing they feared most, which is themselves without distraction, and having survived that, the ordinary turbulence of the external world, the disapproval of others, the uncertainty of outcomes, the inevitable impermanence of circumstances, none of it carries quite the same existential weight. Not because the person has become indifferent to these things, but because they have developed a ground inside themselves that is not entirely dependent on external conditions for its stability. Arendt wrote about natality, the human capacity to begin something new, to introduce genuinely new action into the world. She saw this capacity as the source of human freedom, the possibility that each person carries within them to begin again, to not be entirely determined by what came before. What I want to suggest is that this capacity, this natality, is not equally accessible to all people in all conditions. It tends to develop most fully in the person who has spent real time in solitude, who has done the work of knowing themselves rather than just managing the impression they make on others. Because to begin something genuinely new, to act from a place of authentic choice rather than habit or compliance or social pressure, you have to know what you actually want, what you actually think, what you actually value. And that knowledge does not come easily or quickly. It comes through the slow, uncomfortable, often lonely work of being with yourself long enough to hear what you actually have to say. This is why the person who walks alone tends, over time, to develop a kind of clarity in their decisions that others find difficult to account for, not because they are calculating or strategic, but because they have spent enough time with themselves to have some genuine access to their own values, their own sense of what matters, their own reading of a situation that is not simply borrowed from the consensus around them. They can disagree without performing disagreement. They can hold a position without needing it validated. They can change their mind without the change requiring a public performance of how they arrived at the new position. All of this looks, from the outside, like unusual strength. And it is unusual. But it is not mysterious. It is simply what happens when a person has done the interior work that solitude in its most honest form requires. Return now to the image of where you started, the quiet that follows you, the difficulty of explaining yourself, the sense of becoming something you do not entirely recognize. What if that becoming is not a problem? What if the person you are turning into, in the long work of your solitude, is precisely the person who is capable of standing on their own ground? What if the strength that no one can explain is simply you? After the long work of removing everything that was borrowed, everything that was performed, everything that was maintained for the benefit of others, discovering what remains, What remains is not nothing. It is something denser and more durable than anything that could have been built in the noise and conformation of ordinary social life. It is the self that knows itself, not perfectly, not completely, not without ongoing uncertainty and revision, but genuinely, with a grounded familiarity that changes everything about how you move through the world. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not someone who failed to maintain the connections that would have kept you comfortable. You are someone who walked into the difficult country of yourself and stayed long enough to begin to know it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the rarest and most important things a person can do. And the strength that is coming from that walking, the kind that others sense and cannot name, belongs to you in a way that nothing given from the outside ever could. It grew from your own ground. It is yours in the deepest possible sense.